What we are fighting against are wars that are destroying the environment, destroying our economy, imposing racism, and that are doing nothing to keep us safer. We have a lot of fighting to do.
How could this be in the greatest country that ever existed in the history of the world, that 1 in 5 children, at least, lives in poverty in America?
The statistics on poverty are jarring. As of 2017, according to the census, nearly 40 million people, or more than 1 in 10 Americans, lives in poverty.
The moral budget is pretty much like what Poor People's Campaign compiled, and it's essentially just their demands and kind of like their proof that we have the evidence, we have the empirical data, we did the math, and like these are our demands. We know that it's possible to change systems of power to work around poverty, work out of poverty, and like here's the proof. And I think that's really powerful because they've compiled impacted people's testimonials and just like this like trustworthy document from the Poor People's Campaign that like, yes, it's possible for what we're demanding.
Again, the hearing has come to order. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to welcome once again our panel of witnesses. We appreciate you coming here to help us engage in a meaningful discussion on the character of our country and the ongoing struggle with poverty and economic injustices faced by far too many Americans. I would also like to thank Congresswoman Barbara Lee for her leadership on this issue and her work to bring attention to this ongoing crisis through the Poverty Task Force. The statistics on poverty are jarring. As of 2017, according to the census, nearly 40 million people, or more than 1 in 10 Americans, lives in poverty. But that number, as I know our witnesses will testify to, fails to account for the tens of millions of more Americans who still struggle to make ends meet. At the same time, 90% of households account for less than 23% of the nation's income. This past Sunday marked the longest period of time in U.S. history without an increase in the federal minimum wage. And overall wage growth, after adjusting for inflation, has remained nearly stagnant for 40 years. Meanwhile, housing prices have gone up dramatically in many areas of the country, tuition costs have skyrocketed, and Americans are paying more for nearly every expense. These facts are important, but they tell only part of the story. The purpose of this hearing is to shine a light on the challenges that Americans face in meeting their basic human needs. We will hear from people who experience these challenges firsthand and whose lives are directly impacted by the decisions and policies made in Washington.
I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the opportunity. I thank the bipartisan leadership of the committee for the unanimous consent for the speaker to be allowed to participate, to listen to the testimony, and to share a few thoughts with you. Mr. Chairman, Poverty in America, Economic Realities of Struggling Families, that being the title. I thank you so much for making this opportunity possible for us to hear. And with all due respect to the distinguished ranking member, after listening to his statement, all the more reason we need to hear from our witnesses as to how public policy affects them. The hearing is distinguished by the testimony of leaders of the Poor People's Campaign. We're grateful for the opportunity to listen and learn from Reverend William Barber, Reverend Dr. Liz Theodorakis, and others. I associate myself with your welcome to them all.
Chairman Yarmuth and Ranking Member Womack and members of this committee, I'm Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II from North Carolina. I'm the son of a Navy man who gave first-class service first-class blood and service for second-class citizenship. I'm here as part African-American, part Tuscarora, and part white, so I am diversity looking directly at you. I'm also speaking here today on the thousands of people of every race, creed, and color, gender, and sexuality in the 40 states and District of Columbia that are part of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival. I wanted to be acknowledged today that we are here on the 150th year anniversary of Juneteenth, when slaves finally found out that the Emancipation Proclamation had been written. And here, 51 years after the Poor People's Campaign, it is time for Americans to find out the truth about poverty for all Americans. The growing gap between the rich and the poor in this country is a direct result of policy decisions, not the immorality and the lack of personal work of poor people. Policy decisions made here in Washington and in our state capitals, but those decisions have been supported by well-funded myths. Corporate interests have sent their representatives here to preach personal responsibility and the danger of government intervention. But the truth is, we must take a collective responsibility for the inequality, the unjust laws and systems created. God did not make us poor. Greed and abuse and power make us poor. In this hearing room, you are seated here as members of Congress on the left and on the right, demanding on party affiliation. Our campaign agenda is neither left nor right. It aims to challenge both sides of the aisle. It aims to reach toward the moral high ground. The agenda is rooted in the religious values of the prophet of Isaiah that every legislator ought to hear again since you put your hands on the Bible to swear yourselves into office. Woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children their prey. You should hear what Jesus said, not to churches and personal charity, but to nations. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was a stranger, an immigrant, did you receive me? When I was sick, did you care for me? Because every nation will be judged by God for how it treats the least of these. Our religious values call us, and our constitutional values, which call us to the issue of justice, establishing justice, to put the marginalized and the poor at the center of our public policy. We began 3 years ago. We've been all over this country, from Kansas to Arizona to eastern Kentucky to eastern North Carolina. We've met with Republicans and Democrats and blacks and whites and gay and straight, and all of them are saying the 140 million, we first must get the numbers right. It's 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country. 140 million, 39 million children, 21 million seniors, 65.8 million men, 74 million women, 26 million black people, 38 million Latinx people, 8 million Asian people, 2.4 native indigenous people, and 66 million white people. And they are not poor because they are lazy or because they don't engage in personal responsibility. They are poor because of the systemic realities that connect systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the false moral narratives that suggest that somehow you can ignore poverty. Ignore poverty. We must count 43.5% of our nation. No nation can survive when 43.5% of its people are poor and low wealth, and that's not at the center of our public discussions. 62 million people who work every day for less than a living wage. 37 million people without health care, even with the Affordable Care Act. And I'm from the South, where 1/3 of all the poor people live, and it's almost even black and white. 50-some million poor people and low-income people, and 13 million people uninsured. Poverty is a moral crisis. The federal government, state governments, we do not need more tax cuts for the rich. We do not need more missiles. We need to hear and see the voices and faces of the poverty. We must end this systemic policy violence against poor and low wealth people. This is the moral mandate for our nation at this moment. The work of reconstructing America is not done, and we must do it together, and nothing less than the promise of our democracy is at stake. To not deal with poverty is constitutionally inconsistent, it is economically insane, and it is morally wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of this committee for this opportunity to speak with you today. I come to you this morning, an ordained minister, a biblical scholar, and someone who has been organizing amongst the poor and homeless for over 25 years. First with the National Union of the Homeless, the National Welfare Rights Union, and today proudly with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Over the past years, the Poor People's Campaign has been building committees of poor and dispossessed people, moral leaders, activists, advocates in more than 40 states across this country. We have met with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people and chronicled their demands for a better society. We've spent time in my home state of Wisconsin, where the safety net has been shredded over the past decade. Families go without water and heat, even in the cold winter. We've been in Crossett, Arkansas, where a whole town has been poisoned by a paper plant. Grandparents have to meet their grandkids 80 miles from home just to make sure they're not exposed to those toxins. We've been in Pacoima, California, where 1 in 4 children in the Telfair Elementary School are homeless, are without a home. And Altoona, Pennsylvania, where children, young children, babies, are being taken away from their parents who love them, who care for them, who want to raise them because they can't pay some of the highest water bills in the country. Together, we developed a moral agenda that calls for the elimination of systemic racism and poverty, ecological devastation, and militarism in the war economy. It calls for a challenge of this distorted moral narrative that blames the poor for our poverty, tries to pit us against each other, and feeds us the lie that there isn't enough. When we have beautiful, God-given abundance in this world. You on this budget committee know that talk is cheap. Ultimately, it is our deeds that matter. Budgets reflect our deepest values, our most important priorities. And we are here to say this morning that our nation's budget, as it now stands, reflects the values of the rich, of large corporations, of military contractors at the expense of poor, suffering children, families. We are here to say that we need a moral revolution of values that places the needs and demands of the poor and of the planet at the heart of the budget. This will create more jobs, build up our infrastructure, strengthen our economy, and protect our resources today and for future generations. When you lift from the bottom, everybody rises. So I know this from economics and social science. I've also read it in the Bible. Deuteronomy says, if you forgive debts and you increase programs that lift up the poor, if you pay your workers a living wage and you release those who are oppressed, if you lend out money knowing you may not get paid back, your whole society will be lifted up. Your whole nation will flourish. Poverty is people's creation. It is the creation of immoral budgets and unjust policies, and we can choose to end it. The poor will only be with us as long as we are disobedient to God and to the founding creed of this nation. Thank you for listening.
It seems to me that tackling the issue of poverty should be something that we do in a bipartisan way. Jim Clyburn has frequently raised the issue of the need for Congress to address persistently poor counties. And when you look at the measure of what a persistently poor county is in the United States of America, it's based on the fact that 20% or more of the people have lived below the poverty line for 30 or more years. That's a persistently poor county. And when you look at who represents persistently poor counties in the United States House of Representatives, it's almost equally divided between Democrats and Republicans, both sides of the aisle. Haven't looked at the breakdown in terms of the 116th Congress, but in previous Congresses, in fact, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle represented more persistently poor counties than did members of the House Democratic Caucus. This is an issue that in the past, Dr. King has spoken eloquently about the effort to divide poor whites and poor African Americans from each other, notwithstanding the commonality of condition that can often be found. Dr. Barber, I'd be interested in your take on where the opportunities lie to tackle poverty as a moral imperative, as you've eloquently laid out for the country, but to try to do it in a bipartisan fashion.
First of all, I think that we have to, but I think all of us have to get this right. We're not talking about just addressing poverty a little bit. King talked about ending poverty, militarism, and racism, and ecological devastation of war economy. That's why we've put together a budget as well as the facts. And the reality is, even with the facts, we got to start what's right. 140 million poor people. We got to stop racializing poverty. Like poverty is some black people that don't work that hard enough. The fact of the matter, there are more white people that are poor than there are blacks. In concentration, there's more whites, but it's actually more African Americans. And so we should come together. I was actually looking at the ranking member state in Arkansas. I just thought I'd look at Arkansas. I think this is Arkansas. It says that in Arkansas, 46% of people in Arkansas are poor and low income. 493,000 of them are black, but 863,000 of them are white. Now, all of those folks are not poor because they don't work hard enough. To have an anecdotal evidence about people working hard enough, they're actually proving our point. People shouldn't have to work 3 jobs. That's the point. People shouldn't work without health care. That's the point. People shouldn't have to pray to wait for food to come on their table. That's the point. If you're working, you should be making a living wage. You should have health care in the richest nation in the world. Every one of you that come into this chamber, one of the first things you get is free health care because we pay for it. We pay for it. You make sure that, for instance, you have the ability to, all your pre-clearance. This lady didn't have that chance.
No.
She didn't have that chance. And so what we've put together for you is an agenda of what can happen if we invest in living wages and how many dollars that can put into the economy for everybody. What can happen if we cut the military budget by $350 billion, and it'll still be higher than Russia, Iran, North Korea, all of them combined. We have a complete plan. We're not here talking about Democrat or Republican. We're not trying to racialize, but that's why we disaggregated the number. We're tired of the racialization of poverty, the partisanism of poverty. What we are saying is you cannot have a society where 43% of your people are poor and low wealth. I don't care if they're from Eastern Kentucky, where we have been, that's predominantly white, or Eastern North Carolina, that's predominantly black. It is wrong, and we have a plan, and we must work together to change this.
Thank you, Dr. Barber. One last question. You also mentioned that the traditional poverty measures don't actually capture the distressed conditions that the American people are confronting in incredibly large numbers. And one of the statistics that has startled many of us, I believe, is the fact that at least half the country has indicated that they couldn't afford a sudden, unexpected $400 expense. That's over 160 million people in the United States of America. How do you think we should measure poverty? And maybe Dr. Theo Harris can address that, or Dr. Barber, I yield to you at your discretion.
I'm going to take one shot and turn it to, we have the official poverty measure and the supplemental poverty measure. The problem is even the official poverty measure didn't really measure poverty at the beginning. The supplemental poverty measure looks at poverty based on the federal poverty line, but also those who are less than 200% of the federal poverty line. And what it shows us is that that is a broader measurement. It gives us a truer picture. And if we're going to have this conversation, let's start with the facts, not the phoniness, not the mythology, but let's start with the facts of what's happening to 43.5% of the country. Liz?
Yeah, indeed, we actually need a more effective poverty measure. We need to not just talk about a food budget when housing is one of the the biggest expenses, when healthcare and healthcare crises, when 73% of this country can actually have healthcare insurance and still not be able to afford many of their basic healthcare services, we got a problem.
My name is Callie Greer. I'm a mother of 5, and I've lost 2 of my children for unnecessary reasons. I'm here to talk about Venus. Venus should be here with us today. So Venus started complaining about a little knot she had in her breast. And so since she wasn't employed and didn't have any insurance, she did what we do in our community. She started visiting a emergency room. And so she would go and they just sent her out, and she kept complaining about the knot, and they didn't do anything for her for a while. Then one night she went to the emergency room, and the doctor walked in the room, and he's like, "What's that smell?" And Venus said, "It's my breast. It's rotting." So that's when Venus got some help. She was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and was sent to the cancer center, and she had a radical mastectomy and went into chemo and radiation. For a while, Venus was in remission. About 6 months later, she went back, and the cancer was everywhere. She had spots on her lungs, on bones, on the liver, and so Venus had to have a lot of medications and treatments from the doctor. So, but everything Venus was needed, she had to be approved for it. She had to wait to be approved for the medication. So she would wait weeks and sometimes months to get things that she needed. Well, one of the hardest part of that was for my husband, when Venus was waiting for oxygen. She had to wait about 2 months for the oxygen. But during that time, her dad had to tow her around the house. Yeah. So that was real hard on him, to have to carry his baby around the house. And every time he picked her up, she was lighter and lighter and lighter. So one day, one Friday, Venus was sitting in the chair in the living room, and she said, "Mama," she said, "my head hurt me so bad I can't see." So we took her to the cancer center, and they rushed her to the emergency room, and she had been waiting on a CAT scan that she hadn't gotten. So when we got her there, she lapsed into a coma, and then she got the CAT scan. And she had 2 tumors. Then the head of one had ruptured, and she was brain dead. So, yeah. Where I live, we can't just get a mammogram. You have to have a prescription. So since she didn't have a doctor, she couldn't get the mammogram. But if she had had a doctor, if she had had health care insurance, Venus would be here with us. How much would you pay to have your baby saved? You got a dollar sign right on top of your head, a number. How much would you pay? It's because Venus should be here. She should not. I should not be here. So since she's not here, I'm here for her, and I'm here for the other 140 million people that are struggling and bearing out babies because they don't have health care insurance, something that we shouldn't even have to ask for. We shouldn't have to ask for this. Something that you would even take this job if you couldn't get. We shouldn't have to ask for this. It's a human right. We shouldn't be bearing our babies like this. I'm a little off script, but I just want to let you know that I'm here with the Poor People's Campaign, and I'm fighting this fight. And I'm representing 140 million people today. 140 million. And we're here. We ain't going nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you, members of the committee, for this opportunity. My name is Kenia Alcocer. I came to this country from Guerrero Acapulco, Guerrero, Mexico, as a small child, because my mother was escaping poverty. She wanted to give me and my sisters a better life, and she worked very, very hard for it, sometimes working 2 to 3 jobs at a time. She was a cook in 2 restaurants and was a caretaker for an elderly family, elderly couple. When she would lose a job, she would do anything to make sure that we were provided for. She was even a street vendor at times. Families like mine are very common and have many challenges. Because of poverty and systemic racism, families who are undocumented often have to do multiple jobs, get paid under the table, and often that comes with discrimination and mistreatment. To get by, people in our community have to create survival methods, such as getting together to share meals, taking care of each other's children, and creating a community around us to make sure that we have safety nets. Today, I've come from East Los Angeles because I must fight to advocate for my daughter, all children, and my community. No parent should live with the fear of having their children be taken away from them. I sometimes have that fear that immigration officers might come and take me away, and that my child will be ripped from my arms. I fight for the day when no child has to worry about clean water, a good education, or health care. As members of the Budget Committee, you have tremendous power to shift U.S. priorities in ways that it would help 140 million poor and low-income people and for them to have better lives. You could decide, for example, that it is more important to put children into Head Start than into detention centers. Last year, one of the corporations that operate detention centers got $234 million to buy beds for children. With that money, you could have funded Head Start for more than 26,000 children. One policy gives children lifelong benefits, the other one destroys lives. In fact, we've had 5 children die in detention centers this year. Thousands are being traumatized. You could decide that it's more important to send children to college than to send ICE agents to raid workplaces and separate families. Many poor people like me would like to go to college, but we know that there's not enough financial support, even though we know that the benefits of public investment in higher education far outweighs the cost. Meanwhile, the government has had no trouble finding money to stop people from pursuing the right to live with dignity and humanity. The United States spends more money, 8 times more money on immigration, deportation, and border policies per year now than it did in 1976. President Trump would like to spend tens of billions of dollars on a border wall. He claims immigrants are an economic burden, that we steal jobs and public assistance money. The exact opposite is true. The Congressional Budget Office found that if the United States accepted more immigrants, it would created a path to a legal status. The benefits would outweigh the cost by nearly $20 billion a year. Immigrants contribute to this society every day. They work in your communities. They're the gardeners that are mowing your lawn, the cooks like my mother that are preparing your food, the farm workers who are picking your fruits and vegetables, the nannies who are raising your children. Many of us have been forced to become leaders in our communities, to advocate for our rights, and to fight to have a life that we're not just surviving through, but that we're able to live through with dignity. I am co-director of Unión de Vecinos, and I am the chair of the California Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And we are joining a larger community, a community of poor and dispossessed across this country that are yelling and screaming at you. We are the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and we need you. You have been elected to guide this nation And today we are here to tell you that we need you to end this war economy. You hold in your hand not just the power, but the lives of millions of poor people. My mother crossed the desert to give me a life with dignity and basic human needs, a home, food, and education. I will continue to fight to make sure everybody lives without poverty, systemic racism, ecological devastation, and a violent war economy. And I hope you will too. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Latasha Fields. I am the founder of Christian Home Educator Support System in Chicago, Illinois. I want to thank Chairman Yamath for having me, the Ranking Member Womack, and members of Congress. It's a blessing to be here today. I have been married to Ronald Fields II for 13 and a half years. We are home educators of 4 wonderful children. I have 2 girls, 22 and 3, and 2 boys, 12 and 9. My husband and I are both born and raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I spent 33 years there before I came to move to Chicago, Illinois, 7.5 years ago to expand our evangelistic work. We serve as the overseers and pastors of our Rapport Ministries and Publication in Chicago. I am also the founder of Christian Home Educator, which is a homeschool academy, and Christian Home Support System, which is our support group. These are evangelistic outreach ministries to serve and support the families of the city of Chicago and surrounding communities. We provide assistance, resources about home education, cooperative educational and recreational resources, curriculum and parental rights issues, and much more. Our mission is to empower parents to take back the responsibility of educating their children. I am also the state coordinator of parentalrights.org, a volunteer of Junior Achievement of Chicago, and a member of Cure Clergy Network. I also have over 19 years of entrepreneurial experience, with 14 of those years being consecrated in the real estate industry and several certifications in property management and nonprofit housing. I am also a recent graduate of Trinity Christian College in Palo Heights, Illinois, with a bachelor's degree in business administration with a 4.0 GPA. So let me tell you a little bit about my journey, which is nothing short of the grace of God towards me. My grandmother, who raised me, also raised 9 kids of her own, was a homeowner living in a poor Black, drug-infested community in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She raised me and my younger sister. My mom was a teenage mom on drugs, in and out of prison. My grandmother was a strong woman, hardworking woman. She showed tough love and had amazing independent work ethics. So I basically grew up in a typical Black stigma community surrounding me: the lack of motivation for education, promiscuous behavior, drugs, crime, and some on welfare. In spite of the circumstances that surrounded my childhood, I was one that often fought against the odds. I had a love for education. I never did drugs and I never committed a crime. But however, I did fall into promiscuous behavior, and at the age of 17, I became a teenage mom. This was the turning point of my life. I will never forget the day that I found that I was pregnant. I went into a Planned Parenthood in my neighborhood. I was devastated, I was frightened, and I was scared, because I was one of those kids that excelled in school, was popular in school, played sports, was on the homecoming court. You name it, I was in it. So basically, I kept myself from the normalized behaviors that plagued the Black community. So becoming pregnant was embarrassing to me. I didn't want to be like the rest. I had always strived to be better. I didn't want to be like the social norm. I didn't want to be another statistic. I didn't want to be the 72% of moms raising a child single. So while waiting for the results of my pregnancy test, I was crying and I was thinking how I had ruined my life. The nurse came back in the room and she told me that I was 3 weeks pregnant, and she consoled me that I had another choice. I had a choice to abort my baby. In that very moment, my life flashed before my eyes, because I had a big decision to make. Do I get rid of my baby and proceed as normal, as though nothing happened, and go back to my family and friends and continue to live out my life? Or do I live the rest of my life knowing I had killed my baby? Do I keep my baby and face the challenges that lie ahead of me and press past the shame, the regret, and the disappointment? I chose the latter. I chose to do what I will always hear my grandmother say: you make your bed hard, you lie in it. Those words rang loud and clear in my heart and mind. Yes, we did this. No one else is responsible for the choice we made. I must take responsibility for my actions and live with it. Live the best possible life I can, give my child the best possible life I can, finish high school, go to college, and make something of myself. I decided, in spite of my teenage pregnancy, that I would continue to press past the popularized social norms of the Black community. I worked hard. I graduated from high school 5 months pregnant. During my teenage years, I worked at Burger King. I was a part of an entrepreneurial program that we had. I worked there throughout my high school years from 15 till I graduated, but I was a mom, so I had to continue working at Burger King to provide for myself and my baby. I lived with my grandmother for several months after I had her, and she encouraged me to get on food stamps, to receive WIC, and to receive child care assistance. During this time, she also helped me to get my first apartment. After about 9 months of renting, the real estate company asked me, did I want to buy a house? I was shocked. I was excited. I went through the first-time home buyers program, and I purchased a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house at 18 years old. After 2 years of being on food stamps, I found myself increasingly growing to hate the program. I felt awful while I was on the program. It was such a level of disrespect and deprivation. I couldn't take it any longer. I removed myself from the food stamp program. But however, due to me working and going to college, I had to remain on child care assistance. After having my baby in 1996, buying my home in 1997, the same real estate company offered me a job. I became a secretary, later a rental assistant manager, and later in December 2005, I became a licensed real estate agent. However, from 1996 to early 2005, I was a single mom, working hard, working 2 jobs sometimes, going to college and maintaining honors. By November 2004, I gave my life to Christ. Met my husband. We got married October 2005. After becoming a Christian, I became an ordained minister. My faith began to challenge and propel me to work for families and kids and tackle the problems that plague the Black communities. I lived it, and I wanted to reverse the plague. I had begun and purposed in my heart that I would become that change and advocate for my family and friends. In 2006, I felt compelled by God to take more responsibility for my daughter's education. I took her out of the public education in the 4th grade, and I wanted to give her a Christian education by homeschooling her. So we did.
Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, all the esteemed members of the House Budget Committee, I thank you for this opportunity to share my family's journey out of poverty. Growing up, my wife and I were raised in lower middle class households, went to public schools, experienced some of the same societal ills far too many American children face: abuse, addiction, divorce, depression. Parents who have more bills than money most months were all part of our building blocks that formed our childhood. In 1993, soon after I completed my senior year, my girlfriend informed me that she was pregnant and that I had some serious decisions to make. I was terrified, confused. As I was, it seemed like everyone around me kind of knew what I should do more than I did. And so my friends thought that we should have an abortion, just go ahead and kill the baby, and then you can just go on with your life. My mother, well-meaning, she decided that I should take care of my children, always, but that it's my wife that I shouldn't marry my wife, that I should just basically take care of the kids. This is later on what I found would lead to about 70% of African-American kids being born in the households without fathers. And so I'm so glad I didn't take that advice. Despite all the advice to the contrary, we decided to keep our baby, get married, and trust the Lord for answers along the way. I went home from being a popular student leader, newly enrolled college student, to a poor college dropout and teen father overnight. The first year of our marriage, I made $11,000 in age 17 in debt. While living with our relatives, we had to put our baby girl in the bottom drawer of a dresser to sleep because we just couldn't afford a crib. Her nightlight was the orange security light that shone through the window from the back wall of the grocery store. And my wife and I pillowed our heads at a bed that basically they found my alcoholic uncle dead in just months before we moved in. After living with a few relatives and working hard, I finally was able to move my family into a small duplex apartment in a rough neighborhood. Drugs were being sold across the street. The smell of marijuana frequently crept into the house through the paper-thin walls from our neighbors. Shortly after we had our second daughter, I was working several jobs, struggling to study for the ministry. We finally worked ourselves off of the WIC program, and I even started a small cleaning company where I was thankful basically to work and clean out crack houses that were roach infested and everything from property managers that kind of frequented our company. I was working so much that one day when my wife came, I was home between jobs, and my wife came home and said she was looking for me, calling my name, and she said she came downstairs where I was zoned out staring blankly at an empty TV screen with tears streaming down my face. I was demoralized, utterly exhausted, and I felt like I was beginning to lose my mind. However, Looking back, I can clearly see how the Lord rescued us time and time again, and how when we felt the weakest, he faithfully stepped in to strengthen us. For instance, once when our car broke down, our only car broke down unexpectedly, we had a friend randomly call the house to say that they got an amazing deal at the auto auction. They bought 2 cars, and so they offered the one that they were currently driving to my wife and I. Another time I came home and I put my bags down in the front room, and I saw my wife weeping in the kitchen, looking at the empty cabinets in the refrigerator, and she said, "Lord, I've never seen the righteous forsaken, nor my seed begging bread." And she prayed that we would have food that night. Her friend called that night and said that her brother was working at the grocery store up the street, said that they had some extra meat they were about to throw away, and that night we all ate steak for dinner. And then there was the year we decided to step out on faith and take our children out of the failing public school system. We could not afford private school. Our family thought that we were nuts, but the Lord connected us to a group of homeschool families in our church who took us in, guided us through the entire process. Years and a whole lot of criticism later, when we were able to move into a better neighborhood and enroll our children into a high-performing high school, we once again recognized the sovereign hand of God in the decision that we made to homeschool our children. 2 poor African-American teen parents with little post-secondary education somehow raised 4 brilliant children with exemplary character who would all rank in the top of their classes, 4.0, 4.3, 4.6, mentoring programs, thousands of hours of community service, G.E. Reagan and Merit scholarships, a neuroscience degree from The Ohio State University, double majors. With God's help and a strong community of faith, we were blessed to achieve outcomes that many of our public schools in our area could not, and all from the kitchen table of our modest inner city home. In closing, I understand the pain of poverty and the sense of hopelessness that it engenders. However, I also understand the hope that comes from personal responsibility, strong marriages and families, and an act of faith in Jesus Christ. While there is a place for poverty relief programs in society, for sure, I feel that our reliance upon them has become excessive, and that many of them have grossly missed the mark of empowering their recipients to achieve self-sufficiency. Today, my wife lovingly serves disadvantaged women in one of the poorest neighborhoods of our city. As a youth development consultant and minister, I serve thousands of youth and families per year, teaching character education and the Word of God all over the country and abroad. We just celebrated our 25th year in marriage together, and our 4 children are absolutely thriving. However, there is nothing special about us but for the fact that we are trophies of God's grace and beneficiaries of the love and kindness of family, friends, and others within our community who committed to love God and love their neighbors. To be clear, personal responsibility, strong marriages and families, and an act of faith in Jesus Christ is the formula that worked for us. This is the formula that worked for our ancestors before us. And this is the only formula that will work for Americans today. Government programs will only prove successful to the degree that they supplement these key factors without supplanting them. And I appreciate your time to come and share my family story today. It's a big deal in the Mahan house, and I'm free to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, I tell you, I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. This is a really, really important hearing because the issue of poverty in America is very real. I know because I've got some personal experience with it. And I know many of you are going to look up here and say, yeah, right, okay? But let me give you a little bit of my background. I was born on a 2-wheel wagon rut mule farm. We had no indoor plumbing. We cooked and heated on 2 big old black pot-bellied stoves. We farmed with mules up until I was about 13 years old. We went to the store once a month, and that was to get sugar and salt if we had the money to do it. Everything else came from the sweat of our brow and the toil of our hands in growing and raising what we consumed. My mother worked 3 or 4 jobs, picking cotton, picking tobacco, working on produce farms, you name it. We didn't know we were poor. We thought we lived like everybody else did in the community in which we were raised. Mother had to find a way to take care of 2 kids. So she lied about my age. Mom's dead now, so I can say that. You can't go after her. But she lied about my age to start me to school when I was 5 years old. And because my dad was an alcoholic and she had to jump from place to place to try to find a job because he wasn't providing much input, we were all over the place. 13 schools in 12 years. So education was a big, big problem for me. I didn't get a very good one in elementary school and middle school and high school. And thank God that I lived in a country that helped provide some opportunities. I see a lot of testimony here about Christian principles. We got 2 reverends, 2 pastors, and a lot of people with Jesus signs on their shirts. I've been a Christian since I was 10 years old. And I'm going to tell you, the scriptures that I read, one of the problems that we've got in this country, it's not a head problem, folks, it's a heart problem. Oh, yeah. Because I don't find anywhere in the scripture where Jesus said that it was Caesar's job to feed the poor and to clothe the widows and to take care of the orphans. He said it was the church's. It's the church's responsibility. It's the community's responsibility. It's your neighbor's responsibility. It's your responsibility as a neighbor to do those things. Pastor Mahan, I find your testimony especially inspiring, both because we're fellow Ohioans, and I plan to get with you because I got some thoughts to share with you later, but because you too have thought a lot about how fathers and father figures can impact the lives of children and young adults. I wrote a book about that called Raising Fathers that was published in 2017. We can talk more about that later too, but in your work with at-risk youth, can you describe the effect that a strong male role model can have on young people and their ability to overcome poverty and succeed in the future?
First of all, I appreciate your kind words. I have not seen a more powerful influencer in anti-poverty in a kid's life than a father. Obama said that the leading cause for child poverty was fatherless homes. I've seen it go the positive way, and I've seen it go a negative way. I've seen it where we've got mentoring programs, we're working with kids, father gets out of jail, and that power of a father comes in and undoes everything we did in the mentoring program. But I also see it work in the opposite way, where we can be fathers to the fatherless, where we can go into communities where 80, 90% of the kids have no dads. We can be coaches, we can be mentors, we can be teachers, and turn that kid's life around too by being a father to somebody that didn't have one. It's just it's something that can't be understated, and that's my biggest piece. When I come into the room and I'm hearing folks talk about, I don't hear anybody saying we don't want to end poverty. What I'm hearing is that you've got some that are talking about intentions, and you've got some that are talking about results. And this is not new. We've got the war on poverty that started years ago. We had 7% of the kids in America that were born in homes without fathers. At the end of the daggone thing, today we got 42% of kids in America that have no fathers.
Yeah. Pastor Mahan, I wish I could take all day with you, but let me get to Pastor Fields real quick. Access to quality education is often referred to as the silver bullets for success in life. Can you talk just briefly about some ways that has played out in your life or the lives of your children? What role has federal policy had in your and your children's education?
It has been a tremendous blessing. And like I said, I pulled my daughter out in 4th grade, and so we began to homeschool. And what we've seen what education has done, because of course me and my husband are products of the public education system, but because I've always been a stickler and an advocate for education, with homeschooling my children, their education was unlimited. It was vast. So we were able to give them a quality education. And I believe some of the ones here were saying that even teaching our children our history. So we was able to give them that the public school has failed to give them. And so with me going back to school and just recently graduating in December, I am an advocate for education. I understand where our federal dollars are being spent in order to give us those opportunities to get an education. So education is definitely a key for our children and for society to succeed and to come out of poverty.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, for your championship in championing this particular issue. I'm a little frustrated because I heard a lot about love, and one thing that I know is not because of the lack of love that we're not able to feed our children. It's not because of the lack of love that we are able to house people. It's not the lack of love that we are unable to save people from dying because they don't have health care. It's not because of lack of love that you were able to finish college because you got help with childcare. Love has nothing to do with this. And if you want to bring love into this, you got to bring radical love. Because radical love means that we radically love every single person within our communities to make sure that we are providing for them the basic rights as humans. That's what love is. And that's the godly thing to do. So if we want to talk about faith, we also have to remember that we can't pray our problems away.
Exactly.
You can't pray for your children to be fed, so you're not crying because they're crying and they can't go to bed. You cannot pray for your medical bills to disappear. You cannot pray for the mold to stop poisoning your children in the classrooms. The other thing that frustrates me is people who have experienced poverty, who have gotten the straps for their bootstraps, who sit and talk about how we shouldn't do anything for the next person. See, as someone who knows severe poverty, I lived in a refugee camp, on the floor, no water, nothing. And I hear somebody say here in the United States, they're fine with their grandparents not having running water? And that's supposed to be okay? Or we hear someone say, it was a choice made up to me to have my children and not be like the other black people who get to have children out of wedlock. We don't get to have those kind of conversations. The conversations we get to have is how we are responsible for fully funding our schools so all of our children have the opportunities we have as we sit in this room. We get to talk about the kind of opportunities we have as government to make sure healthcare is provided to everybody so that we don't have people dying in the United States because they can't afford insulin. The conversation we get to have is making sure that there are no children going to sleep hungry or being shamed in classrooms and in lunchrooms because their families don't have enough money to pay for their lunch. The conversation we get to have about the kind of poverty we have in this country is the kind of poverty that says it is okay for us to take photo pictures with veterans and be okay with the fact that they're sleeping on the streets here in the United States. So as an immigrant, as someone who came to this country, hearing about American exceptionalism and prosperity, I am appalled that we get to sit here and have conversations as Americans about being the most charitable country in the world and not being charitable enough to house our homeless, feed our children, care for our veterans. What is charitable about that? So I ask you, the kind of systematic barriers that exist in prosperity, that's the conversation we should be having. And so I want you guys to, for the little bit of time that I have, to talk about the systematic barriers that exist in creating prosperity and what it means for us to remove those so that all of us could have the prosperity that is guaranteed within our Constitution.
You know, I come from somebody who, and the people here who remember, who know that we were deeply impacted by government, by Caesar, if you will. And it took religious people who had to stand up to Caesar when Caesar said separate but equal. There wasn't but one dissenter, Justice Holland out of Eastern Kentucky, that stood up to that, but he stood up. And because he stood up, he eventually brought other people to his position and we won. Somebody has to stand up to the lies. I've heard so many distortions here today, it actually hurts my head. I mean, to suggest that these people who work hard, we all have to tell our stories and our children, but to somebody to say, well, Jesus never said anything about Caesar. First of all, it's interesting that you all would define yourself as Caesar. That in itself is kind of strange. I mean, we need to stop for a minute to even hear that.
Yeah.
And then the next thing is that you haven't read the 2,000 scriptures in the Bible that talk about how societies have supposed to treat the poor, the immigrant, the least of these and left out. And you don't know that Jesus started his first sermon with good news to the Patokos. That's a Greek word which means those who have been made poor by economic systems. I mean, it really is shocking that folk are saying the same thing that we heard people say about slavery. Slaves just work hard and wait. Civil rights, we don't need to be involved, just work hard and wait. Social Security, you know, same people are against Social Security, and they say God was against it. It is bothersome that in the 21st century, we still have these weak, tired, old mythologies lying about the war on poverty when the Russell Sage Foundation actually says that it did decrease poverty, but we left the field. So I would say to all of us, Democrats and Republicans, we brought you people, Republicans, Democrats, whites and black, see the people. Stop just talking about I know poverty and hear what these folk are saying and put together a full plan to deal with this issue. This is traumatic to see this happening in America today, that people would stick with their partisan line and ignore the people that are really hurting.
I just want to start by saying I'm stunned that basically we've had unanimous acknowledgement that poverty is widespread across this country. We have pulled a group of testifiers who are deeply personally impacted by these problems. They are in the room, and people are not talking to them.
Oh.
People are not asking questions about how are we going to solve this problem of homelessness and an increased rate of evictions. And then people are being blamed for the problems that this society has caused. How is it that you can say the war on poverty failed when it is politicians who defunded that war? How can you say that Head Start is a personal charity when it has lifted 65 million children out of poverty since it was started? So it feels very important to me to say we need a real, serious conversation in this country, led by those that are most impacted. And I love this question of, does the Bible say anything about what nations, what Caesars are supposed to do? Because Matthew 25 says, I was hungry to the nations, not to a church, not to a charity, not to an individual. I was hungry. And what did your nation do? I was homeless. And did you cut public housing? Or did you start building new public housing? I was homeless. And did you allow banks to be bailed out? But families who owe more on their houses than they're worth to become homeless. We have a moral crisis in this country. It is a crisis when 250,000 people can die every year because of poverty. And people in this committee can admit that in your towns there are people hurting. Well, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? No. And when we talk about housing subsidies, we heard the power of them. You got a loan.
Yeah.
You were able to get a house. That is government helping out. You were on food programs. That is the government helping out. We need more of these programs. We need to lift wages. How is it possible that in this country there's not one county where if you're working minimum wage, you can afford a 2-bedroom apartment?
Reverend,
So we got to connect this housing and this poverty and these wages and lift the load of poverty.